everybody. I'm delighted to be here, and thanks in advance for listening to my presentation. Today I'm going to try to answer two questions for you. The first one is whose responsibility is growth? And the second one is how do we set up our company for long-term sustainable growth? But I'd like to be clear from the start. The first question is really a rhetorical one. Growth should be everybody's responsibility. The problem with making everybody responsible, though, is that you need to enable people to actually deliver growth. So how do we do that? We need to make sure that we enable the two fundamental components of growth. The first one is all about the growth science. I think the most popular term is growth hacking, really, and I'm probably sure you are familiar with that. It's all about the AAR metrics, A/B testing, defining your North Star metric, and optimizing your growth loops. The second component, which is the one I'm focusing on today, is the growth culture, and that's the one that normally sits below the surface of the iceberg. This is all about recruiting and nurturing the right people, the right growth talent, building up a psychologically safe environment, and embedding the right growth mindset that will enable to set up your organization for sustainable growth. So, I'm insisting on the fact that we need a growth culture. And why is that? Because even if you start growing very well, your startup, as you can see in this graph behind me, and even if you have the luck to have a lot of money to invest in it and to recruit a lot of people, you will inevitably incur into inflection points, also called productivity plateaus. And the only way to go through those safely is to enable a strong, growth-oriented organization. So how do we start doing that? I guess I will start saying how not to start doing that. This is a question that I get asked a lot. What is the right structure for growth? That is not the right question to ask in the first place. The right thing to do is to start identifying the opportunities for growth, sometimes also called problems. Once you have a good problems to fix, then you can start thinking about the right team to go and fix that problem. And once you have your teams defined, then you can start thinking about the structure. But at this point, you might ask yourself, okay, but who is the best person to actually go and fix that problem or help the organization solve that growth issue? Well, it's none of these that you see here. The right person is someone with a growth mindset. Someone that has the willpower to identify, define, and solve a problem that is keeping your team or your startup from growing faster, more, and better. And why a growth mindset is so important? Because a growth mindset has been proven by research that drives motivation and achievement. This term has been coined by Dr. Carol Dweck over 20 years ago, so it's not a brand new concept. This doctor was actually very intrigued by studying the behavior of thousands of her students that seemed to react very differently to impediments and challenges. Some of them were devastated by even the most minimum challenge. Others rebound very quickly, and they seemed to believe that through effort they could achieve more, grow, and become better. So that's when she coined these two terms that you see here, fixed mindset as opposed to the growth one. I'd like you to go through quickly, mentally, this chart behind me and try to assess yourself. Where do you see yourself being scored? Someone with a growth mindset, just to make an example, is someone that can take feedback constructively. These people like feedback. They take it to grow. While people with a fixed mindset normally tend to get defensive. They don't like to be criticized at all. And when we talk about mistakes, a growth-minded person takes that as a learning opportunity, while on the opposite spectrum, a fixed-minded person hates making mistakes. They will try to avoid them by all means. So, the question to ask at this point is, how do we recruit the right growth talent? So based on what I've just shared with you, the first thing to look for is actually that they do have a growth mindset. Of course, that alone doesn't do the trick, right? We also need to make sure that they understand and that they can learn at their best the growth discipline. So how do they hack growth for your organization? And last but not least, they also need to be pretty good in their core specialism. Might be an engineer, a product manager, a marketeer, and so on. But the first aspect in your interviewing process should be to assess if your candidates have got a growth mindset. So you will need to check things like their attitude towards perseverance, towards working through challenges, towards learning, towards mistakes, and things that compose the growth mindset itself. In the light of what I've just said, I'd like to ask you to think about how do you currently recruit in your organization? If you're a hiring manager or not, I'm pretty sure you know how you select for talent. Do you actually check if your candidates have got a growth mindset? And do you have one yourself? And at this point, it would be also nice to revisit who is responsible for growth in your startup. Is it everybody or not yet? So we got a good problem to solve now. We know that we need someone with the growth mindset and the knowledge of the growth discipline. What is the right growth team that we need to put together? Well, it's probably worth reminding the definition of growth, which is basically the mix of marketing, product, and engineering. And why is that? That's because differently from the traditional marketing that only focuses on acquisition, growth looks after the entire user funnel, from acquisition to retention, referrals, and revenue. So if we accept that the jobs to be done for growth are more and different, then obviously the collective skill set that we need to recruit for are also very different. And they sit across what you see visualized here. Okay, so what type of team do we actually need? Well, Simon Sinek would suggest to start with a why. Why do we create a team? Again, that's quite simple, to solve a problem, to work on a growth opportunity. So once we have the problem clearly defined, we just need to find the right mix of growth people that are best suited to solve that problem. I have modified a table here for you about the possible existing growth roles. These are all people, from a product manager to an engineer to a designer, that basically have a growth mindset. They know very well how to do growth hacking, and of course, they are great at their core specialism. I'm going to share a direct example that I implemented when we were pioneering at Skyscanner in moving to become a growth organization. This is the Italian squad. These guys had as a mission to become #1 in the Italian market. But of course, they had a lot of limitations, because with the traditional marketing asset, they couldn't really deliver growth. They couldn't even build landing pages that were localized for the market. So basically, we gave them the opportunity to become an autonomous and independent startup in itself that could move in an agile and fast and effective way. No need to say that this team actually managed to become #1 in the market within a year. So at this point, yes, it becomes the right time to ask the question, okay, what is the right structure for growth then in my organization? And again, let me share a quick example with you. The first structure that we tested at Skyscanner was what is called commonly the independent growth structure. So we created different growth teams that were separated from the product and engineering tribes. And they were basically looking after growth enablement for the regions. So looking at things like marketing automation, algorithmic marketing in general, enablement of the channel, internationalization, localization, and then supporting the markets in whatever they needed to grow. The independent model has got different facets. So you can see here one that was adopted by Skyscanner and also by Uber. It's organized by flows and features. So sign-ups, onboarding, notifications, these are areas for growth opportunity, as I mentioned before. These teams in this model report into a VP of growth. Another variation of the independent model that you might want to consider for your startup is organized by metrics. This was adopted by companies like Invoice2Go and Pinterest for a while. So the teams basically focus on increasing the AAR metrics specifically. The second option that you've got available is called functional model. And basically, the teams still focus on solving growth problems or growth opportunities, like sign-ups, onboarding, channel enablement, but they do not report into a growth function. They report, for example, into a VP of product. And companies like Twitter, LinkedIn, Dropbox, and BitTorrent actually all experimented with this. What are the pros and cons of the two models? I've tried to summarize quickly in this visualization. The independent model basically helps you spreading the best growth science faster than the other one. And the experimentation also gets done at speed compared to the functional model. However, the drawback here is that sometimes it creates tension between UX and the growth metrics. And that's the reason why, for example, Pinterest moved from this model to the functional one in a second phase. The functional one reduces this tension, but it is slightly less transparent in terms of the growth initiatives that get carried out. When we look at the outcomes, based on the research that is done by Andrew McInnes, they score very similarly. So it's not a question of outcomes. It's a question of you choosing for your best fit. What suits your culture, your values, and your current setup? What is less disruptive for you to implement, to test, and to validate? One thing that is important to say is that one structure is not fit for purpose forever. Your company hopefully will grow, will change. You'll hire many more employees, and the problems you need to solve change with that. So again, another example that I brought from Skyscanner experience. At some point, we realized that the silos between the growth teams and the product teams were quite dysfunctional. So what we've done was to bring in a new model for which we implemented and embedded senior growth people into the product teams, so that growth, product, and engineering could work together as a leadership and basically embed growth at the core of the product development. At this point, I get asked often this question as well. Should I call it a growth team or not? Well, the reality is that calling it growth or not doesn't really matter. What matters is what sets apart successful teams from non-successful teams. And the answer comes to us by Julia Rosowski. She's an analyst in the Google People Operation teams that contributed to the Project Aristotle. And basically, her conclusion is that who is on a team matters less than how the team members interact, structure their work, and view their contribution. She clearly defined actually 5 factors that define successful teams from teams that are not so successful. You can see them listed here. But by far, the most important one resulted to be psychological safety. This is a term that was coined by Harvard professor Amy Edmondson. And basically, it's a shared belief held by members of a team that the team itself is safe for interpersonal risk-taking. What does it mean in simple terms? That if I'm in my team, I feel safe in showing myself as vulnerable to you. And I won't be afraid of sharing that I made a mistake because I know that I'm not going to be misjudged. So if you're a leader or a manager, at this point, I would expect you to ask yourself, how can I foster psychological safety in my teams? Well, Professor Edmondson gave us some tips on how to do it. The first one is that you should frame the work as a learning problem, not as an execution problem. The second one is that you should always acknowledge your own fallibility. If you're leading by example, admitting that you also make mistakes, the others will not be afraid of doing the same. The third one is to model curiosity and ask lots of questions, because this develops also a growth mindset. At this point, I'd like to make clearer how psychological safety is tied to growth, and why is it so important to set up your organization for long-term sustainable growth. Well, the point is that if I feel psychologically safe, I feel comfortable in admitting mistakes. If I am comfortable in doing that, I can learn from my failure. And if I do that, everyone in my business will start sharing ideas openly and safely. The more ideas get shared, the more hypotheses for A/B testing get generated. And the more experiments you run, the more likely it is that you're going to grow. So this is what I call the virtual cycle of psychological safety. So I'd like to just summarize for you today the quick learnings that hopefully you can take away with you. I wanted to address the problem of how do we set up our organization for sustainable long-term growth. And I share that you need to implement and embed in your organization two things. The first one is the growth discipline, that is all about the maths and the science of growth. The second, and most hidden one, and often overlooked because it takes a lot of continuous effort, is the growth culture. And how can you build that? The first thing is you need to create and maintain a psychologically safe environment. The second one is trying to build your teams around good growth problem, hiring or nurturing right growth talent, creating teams with growth DNA in it. And how can you do that? Obviously, making sure that they have a growth mindset and that they know the growth science at their best. The last thing that I talked about was how to pick your structure. I shared with you the independent and functional model, and of course, that's also up for experimentation. You might create a new one, your own, that actually fits your needs. So that's really up to you and up to your creativity and experimentation. Thank you very much for listening, and have a good rest of the day.